On a cold March morning in 1960, three friends from suburban Chicago embarked on what should have been a peaceful getaway to one of Illinois' most beautiful natural wonders. Frances Murphy, Mildred Lindquist, and Lillian Oetting had no way of knowing that their hiking trip to Starved Rock State Park would end in unimaginable brutality. Their murders would captivate a nation, lead to one of the most controversial convictions in American legal history, and spawn a mystery that would haunt the corridors of justice for more than 6 decades. The question at the heart of this case is deceptively simple, yet maddeningly complex. Did a 21-year-old dishwasher named Chester Weger brutally bludgeon 3 middle-aged women to death in a snow-covered canyon, or was he the victim of a colossal miscarriage of justice that would keep an innocent man locked away for nearly 60 years? The answer depends on who you ask. To prosecutors and many in law enforcement, Weger's confession provided irrefutable proof of his guilt. To his defenders and a growing chorus of legal experts, that same confession represents a textbook example of how psychological coercion and threats can compel an innocent person to admit to crimes they never committed. This is the story of the Starved Rock murders, a tale of 3 vibrant women whose lives were cut short, a young man who would become Illinois' longest-serving inmate, dedicated attorneys fighting to exonerate a man they believe was wrongfully convicted. On the morning of Monday, March 14, 1960, the 3 women climbed into Frances Murphy's gray Ford station wagon and headed southwest towards Starved Rock State Park. The drive would take them through the flat expanses of Illinois farmland, eventually bringing them to the Illinois River Valley, where Starved Rock stood as a magnificent geological monument. The massive sandstone butte rose 125 feet above the ID. Illinois River and the surrounding park featured 18 canyons carved into the St. Peter sandstone by glacial meltwater thousands of years ago. The park held a dark history in its very name. According to legend, in the 1760s, a band of Illinois tribe members had taken refuge atop the Great Rock Formation while being besieged by members of the Potawatomi and other tribes seeking revenge for the murder of the Ottawa chief Pontiac. The Illinois tribe members, trapped on the rock with no access to food or water, eventually starved to death. Whether this account reflected historical fact or frontier mythology, the name had stuck, and Starved Rock became one of the most popular destinations for Chicagoans seeking to escape the city for natural beauty. The women arrived at Starved Rock Lodge late in the morning and checked into their accommodations. The lodge itself was a rustic but comfortable establishment that catered to the steady stream of visitors who came to explore the park's scenic wonders. After settling into their rooms and eating lunch in the lodge's dining room, the 3 friends set out for an afternoon of exploration. They carried with them binoculars for birdwatching, cameras to capture the beauty of the frozen waterfalls and snow-draped canyon walls, and the simple joy of being outdoors together. The last photographs ever taken of Frances Murphy and Mildred Lindquist would come from that afternoon. Lillian Oetting, standing behind the lens of Mildred's Argus C3 camera, captured her 2 smiling friends posing near the frozen waterfall in St. Louis Canyon. In one frame, Mildred stands in the foreground, bundled against the March cold, her expression cheerful. In another exposure on the same frame of film, Frances appears in front of the spectacular ice formations created by the frozen cascade. These images, recovered when police later developed the film, would become haunting evidence that the women had entered the canyon willingly, without any apparent sign of distress or awareness of the horror that awaited them. That evening, the 3 women should have called home to let their husbands know they had arrived safely. George Oetting, still recovering at home, waited for his wife's promised phone call. When it didn't come, he wasn't immediately alarmed. Perhaps they had gotten caught up in conversation. Perhaps they had gone out to dinner and it slipped Lillian's mind. He went to bed that night with only mild concern, assuming he would hear from her the following morning. Tuesday morning brought no such reassurance. When George called the lodge and asked to speak with his wife, a staff member mistakenly told him that the three women had been seen at breakfast and were simply out of the lodge at the moment. This false information provided temporary relief. George ended the call, reassured that everything was fine, not knowing that his wife and her two friends had already been dead for nearly 24 hours. By Wednesday morning, the accumulation of failed contact attempts had transformed concern into genuine alarm. George Oetting called the lodge again, and this time employees checked the women's rooms, and what they found sent chills through everyone who heard the news. The beds were undisturbed, still made from when housekeeping had serviced them on Monday. The women's suitcases remained packed, their belongings untouched. A quick check of the parking lot revealed that Frances Murphy's Ford station wagon sat exactly where she had parked it on Monday morning, covered now in a fresh dusting of snow. George Oetting's next call went to his longtime friend Virgil Peterson, the operating director of the Chicago Crime Commission. Peterson, a former FBI agent whose connections in law enforcement ran deep throughout Illinois, immediately contacted the chief of the Illinois State Police. Within minutes, multiple law enforcement agencies had been notified, and the machinery of a major search operation began to grind into motion. Sheriff Ray Utze of LaSalle County organized search parties that began fanning out across the vast expanse of starved Rock State Park. Volunteers joined state and local police officers in combing through the network of trails, canyons, and overlooks. The park covered more than 2,000 acres of rugged terrain, and with the ground covered in snow and ice, the search presented significant challenges. Hours passed with no sign of the missing women, and as afternoon shadows began to lengthen, the searchers' hopes began to fade. Then, late Wednesday morning, the search came to a terrible end. In the frozen depths of St. Louis Canyon, one of the park's most beautiful and secluded spots, searchers discovered 3 bodies at the mouth of a shallow cave. The scene that confronted them would be seared into the memories of everyone who witnessed it. The 3 women lay partially covered by snow and fallen debris, their hands bound with twine, their bodies showing evidence of unspeakable violence. The crime scene in St. Louis Canyon presented investigators with a tableau of brutality that shocked even hardened law enforcement veterans. The location itself was remote, accessible only by hiking deep into the canyon system. High sandstone walls rose on either side, creating a sense of isolation and enclosure. In warmer months, a waterfall cascaded down the rock face, but in mid-March, the water had frozen into spectacular ice formations. It was this frozen beauty that had likely drawn the 3 women into the canyon on Monday afternoon, cameras and binoculars in hand, expecting to spend a peaceful hour enjoying nature's winter artistry. Instead, they had encountered someone or something that transformed their afternoon of leisure into a nightmare of violence. The medical examiner's initial assessment revealed that all 3 women had suffered severe head trauma. They had been struck repeatedly with a level of force and ferocity that spoke to either rage, panic, or determination to ensure they could not survive to identify their attacker. The wounds numbered over 100 in total across the 3 victims, concentrated primarily on their heads and faces. 2 of the women had been partially disrobed, their lower garments removed, which initially suggested a sexual motive for the attack. However, subsequent medical examination would reveal no evidence of sexual assault on any of the victims. This finding would complicate investigators' efforts to understand the motive behind the killings. If not sexual assault, then what had driven someone to commit such savage violence against 3 middle-aged women on a Monday afternoon in a public state park? The physical evidence scattered around the crime scene began to tell a story, though not a complete one. A frozen tree branch, approximately 3 feet long and 4 inches in diameter, lay near the bodies, its surface coated with blood and hair. This improvised weapon appeared to be the primary instrument of the attack. The branch had sufficient weight and heft to deliver devastating blows, and wood analysis would later confirm that it had likely broken from a tree in the immediate area. The killer had grabbed what was readily available and used it with terrible effectiveness. Near the bodies, investigators found personal items belonging to the victims, items that suggested the attack may have begun as a robbery. Mildred Lindquist's camera lay on the ground, its case broken and the strap severed. The camera itself had been smashed, likely in the struggle or during the attack. A pair of binoculars had been broken into two pieces, the metal frame bent and twisted. These items represented potential evidence of how the encounter had begun. Had someone attempted to rob the women of their cameras and binoculars? Had they resisted, triggering the violence that followed? The binding of the victim's hands told another crucial part of the story. Someone had used lengths of twine to tie the women's wrists, an action that required both preparation and a degree of cold-blooded calculation. The binding had occurred either before or after the fatal blows, but its presence indicated this was not simply an impulsive attack that spiraled out of control. Someone had thought to restrain the victims, suggesting either planning or, at minimum, a progression of events that went beyond a simple moment of panic. One detail would prove particularly significant in the years of investigation and legal battles to come. Frances Murphy's left index finger had been severed post-mortem, the tip of the finger removed and never recovered from the scene. This macabre detail would generate numerous theories over the decades. Was it a mob signature, a deliberate mutilation meant to send a message? Had the killer taken it as a trophy? Or was there some other explanation that had never been adequately explored? Crime scene investigators worked methodically through the cave and surrounding area, collecting every piece of potential evidence they could find. They recovered strands of hair, both blonde and dark, that clearly did not all belong to the victims. They found cigarette butts that might have been dropped by the killer or killers. They carefully bagged samples of the blood-soaked earth, fragments of torn clothing, and numerous other trace materials that might eventually point toward whoever had committed these murders. The development of the film from Mildred Lindquist's damaged camera provided investigators with their first significant timeline evidence. The photographs showed Frances and Mildred alive and smiling in St. Louis Canyon, likely taken within an hour or so of their deaths. One frame contained a triple exposure that would intrigue investigators. They hoped it might have captured an image of the killer, but analysis revealed only the expected shots of the two women and the canyon scenery. Still, the photographs confirmed that the women had entered the canyon of their own volition, appearing relaxed and happy, with no indication they felt threatened or were being followed. As news of the murders spread throughout the Chicago area and beyond, public reaction combined horror, grief, and fear. 3 respectable matrons from an affluent suburb murdered in broad daylight in a popular state park. If this could happen to women like Frances Murphy, Mildred Lindquist, and Lillian Oetting, then who was safe? The pressure on law enforcement to identify and apprehend the killer or killers became immense. Newspaper headlines screamed the story across front pages. Radio broadcasts devoted extensive coverage to every development. The Starved Rock murders became the crime story of 1960, and everyone from the governor's office down to the local sheriff felt the weight of public expectation demanding swift justice. The husbands of the murdered women, devastated by their losses, worked with their companies to post a substantial reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of whoever had killed their wives. The reward money eventually reached a sum that would be equivalent to hundreds of thousands of dollars in today's currency. This financial incentive, combined with the intense media coverage and public interest in the case, ensured that tips and leads would pour into law enforcement offices in the weeks and months ahead. But in those first days after the discovery of the bodies, investigators faced a frustrating lack of clear direction. They had a brutal crime scene, they had evidence of violence and possible robbery. But they had no obvious suspects, No witnesses who had seen anything suspicious, and no clear motive that explained why someone would commit such extreme violence against 3 tourists enjoying an afternoon hike. If you found this deep dive into one of America's most enduring criminal mysteries compelling, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. The investigation would need to cast a wide net, examining every employee at Starved Rock Lodge, every visitor who had been at the park that day, every known criminal in the region with a history of violence or sexual assault. It was exhaustive, painstaking work that consumed thousands of man-hours and generated mountains of paperwork. And eventually, that investigation would focus with increasing intensity on a young man who washed dishes in the kitchen at Starved Rock Lodge, a war veteran with a wife and 2 small children, a man whose face bore scratches in the days after the murders, a man whose life was about to be irrevocably altered by forces he would later claim he was powerless to resist. Chester Otto Weger came into the world on March 3, 1939, in the working-class environs of LaSalle County, Illinois. His childhood and adolescence unfolded in the small towns that dotted the Illinois River Valley, communities where most people knew their neighbors, where economic opportunities were limited, and where young men often followed their fathers into manual labor, factory work, or military service. Chester's upbringing was unremarkable in the way that most working-class childhoods were unremarkable in mid-20th century America. Modest means, hard work, and limited educational opportunities. As a young man, Chester made the decision that countless other young American men of his generation made. He enlisted in the United States Marine Corps, serving his country during the peacetime years of the late 1950s. The Marines instilled in him discipline, order, and a sense of duty, though his service was brief and without particular distinction. When he completed his enlistment, Chester returned to LaSalle County, where he married a local young woman named Joanne and started a family. By the time he reached his 21st birthday in March of 1960, Chester was the father of 2 small children, including a 3-year-old daughter named Becky. Employment opportunities in the Illinois Valley were limited for a young man without specialized skills or higher education. Chester found work where he could, and in early 1960, he held a position as a dishwasher in the kitchen at Starved Rock Lodge. It was menial work, the kind of job that offered low pay and little prestige, but it provided a paycheck that helped support his young family. He worked the typical shifts, arriving early in the morning to handle breakfast dishes, working through the lunch rush, and sometimes covering dinner service as well. Those who worked alongside Chester at the lodge would later describe him as quiet and unremarkable. He wasn't particularly outgoing or gregarious. He did his work without complaint, kept to himself for the most part, and seemed like dozens of other young men trying to make ends meet and provide for their families. His criminal record at the time consisted of minor offenses, nothing that suggested any capacity for violence or indicated he might pose a danger to anyone. He was, by all outward appearances, an ordinary working-class father, trying to get by in a world that offered limited opportunities for people of his background and station. But there was one incident in Chester Weger's recent past that would prove highly significant when investigators began looking for anyone connected to Starved Rock who might have a history of violent crime. In September of 1959, approximately 6 months before the murders of the 3 women, a crime had occurred at Matthiasson State Park, located just a few miles from Starved Rock. A teenage boy and girl had been hiking when they encountered an assailant who bound them with twine, separated them, and then sexually assaulted the girl before fleeing. The crime had been investigated, but no arrest had been made at the time. When investigators later showed the female victim a photo array of potential suspects, she identified Chester Weger as resembling her attacker. The similarity between the two crimes, particularly the use of twine to bind victims, would not be lost on investigators when they began examining Weger as a potential suspect in the Starved Rock murders. Whether this earlier incident represented solid evidence of a pattern of violent behavior or an unreliable identification of someone who simply looked similar to the actual perpetrator would become a matter of fierce debate in the years ahead. In the immediate aftermath of the discovery of the 3 bodies in St. Louis Canyon, Chester Weger was just one of many Starved Rock Lodge employees who underwent questioning by Illinois State Police investigators. The interviews were routine, the kind of basic information gathering that would be expected in any major criminal investigation. Where were you on Monday afternoon? Did you see anything unusual? Did you notice any suspicious individuals around the lodge or the park? Chester answered the questions put to him, stating that he had been at work during the relevant time period, that he hadn't seen or heard anything that seemed out of the ordinary, that he knew nothing about the murders beyond what everyone else had heard. Several of Chester's co-workers, however, reported something that caught investigators' attention. In the days immediately following the murders, they had noticed scratches on Chester's face. When asked about these facial injuries, Chester had a ready explanation. He claimed he had been getting a haircut and that the scratches came from shaving. It was a plausible explanation on its face. Many men nicked themselves while shaving, and a few careless passes with a straight razor could certainly result in visible marks. But in the context of a murder investigation where the killer might well have sustained scratches during a violent struggle with 3 victims, these facial injuries took on potentially greater significance. Over the following weeks and months, Chester Weger underwent repeated questioning by law enforcement. He was administered polygraph examinations, the so-called lie detector tests that measured physiological responses to determine whether a subject was being truthful. Chester passed 6 such examinations conducted by Illinois State Police. 6 times, the polygraph examiner concluded that his answers were truthful, that he showed no deception when he denied involvement in the murders. For most suspects, passing 6 polygraph tests would effectively eliminate them from serious consideration. But investigators were not ready to move on from Chester Weger. The state's attorney for LaSalle County, Harland Warren, faced tremendous pressure to solve the case. The murders had shocked the region and garnered national attention. The victims' families wanted justice. The public wanted to feel safe visiting Starved Rock again. Warren's political future depended significantly on his ability to bring the killer or killers to justice. And as the investigation ground forward through the summer and into the fall of 1960, without producing a viable suspect, that pressure only intensified. In the interest of narrowing down potential suspects among the lodge employees, Warren arranged for additional polygraph testing. He hired an examiner from John E. Reed & Associates, a Chicago firm that was pioneering new interrogation techniques based on psychological manipulation and pressure. These techniques, which would later become known collectively as the Reed technique, were based on the premise that skilled interrogators could elicit confessions through a combination of confrontation, minimization of moral culpability, and the presentation of real or fabricated evidence of guilt. When Chester Weger underwent this new round of polygraph testing in late September, the results were dramatically different from his previous 6 examinations. The Reed examiner concluded that Weger was being deceptive, that his physiological responses indicated he was lying when he denied involvement in the murders. Whether this represented a genuine change in Chester's responses, a difference in the sensitivity or interpretation of the Reed equipment, or simply a predetermined conclusion the examiner had reached before the test even began, would become a matter of endless dispute. What is beyond dispute is what happened next. Based on the failed polygraph result, LaSalle County Sheriff's Deputy William Dummett and Assistant State's Attorney Craig Armstrong drove to Chester's father's home in Oglesby early on the morning of September 27th. They picked up Chester and drove him to the Reed headquarters in Chicago for more intensive questioning. What transpired over the next several hours represents one of the most controversial aspects of the entire Starved Rock case. According to Chester's later testimony, the interrogation was relentless and psychologically brutal. Over the course of 2 to 3 hours, the Reed examiner, John Reed himself, discussed the case with Chester while administering additional polygraph tests. When Reed concluded that Chester was being misleading, he spent hours trying to persuade him to tell what Reed insisted was the truth. Despite the mounting pressure, Chester maintained that he had nothing to do with the killings. Into the afternoon and evening, Reed and an assistant continued the interrogation, employing various psychological techniques designed to break down Chester's resistance. During one polygraph test, Chester would later testify, Reed instructed him to answer yes to every question, including direct questions about whether he had murdered the 3 women. When Chester refused to comply with these instructions, the psychological pressure increased. At one point, Reed allegedly threatened to inject Chester with truth serum, a threat that may or may not have been serious, but which certainly would have been frightening to a young man with limited education and no experience with such interrogations. Chester finally left Reed's office sometime around midnight, having been questioned for approximately 15 hours straight. But the interrogation did not end when he walked out of the Reed building. In the front seat of Deputy Dummett's Chrysler, with Chester sandwiched between Dummett and Armstrong for the long drive back to LaSalle County, the pressure continued. According to Chester's later testimony, Dummett told him explicitly that if he did not sign a confession, he would be sentenced to the electric chair. Chester would later testify that Dummett used a specific phrase, "Chester, you're going to ride a thunderbolt," a reference to the electric chair that awaited murderers in Illinois. Interestingly, while Deputy Dummett would later deny making such threats, Assistant State's Attorney Craig Armstrong, who was present in the vehicle, would testify that Dummett had indeed threatened Chester with the electric chair multiple times during that drive. This contradiction in the testimony of the law enforcement officials themselves would raise questions about the reliability of their accounts and the methods they employed. Chester survived that initial marathon interrogation session without confessing, but the ordeal was far from over. Illinois State Police began conducting continuous surveillance on Chester. For weeks, he could not leave his home, could not go to work, could not move about freely without knowing that law enforcement was watching his every move. The psychological weight of constant surveillance, combined with the knowledge that investigators believed he was guilty and were determined to prove it, placed Chester under enormous stress. On November 16, 1960, 8 months after the murders, LaSalle County authorities picked Chester up once again for questioning. This time, they brought him to the state's attorney's office in Ottawa. What followed was another marathon interrogation session, this one lasting through the night and into the early morning hours of November 17th. Chester was served with 9 warrants, 3 of them related to the Starved Rock murders and others related to additional crimes, including the Matheson State Park assault. He was placed in a lineup and viewed by witnesses and victims of other crimes. Then came more hours of interrogation, more threats about the electric chair, more psychological pressure applied by men who were convinced they had their killer and were determined to extract a confession. Chester had been awake for hours. He had endured months of surveillance and repeated interrogations. He had been threatened with death. He had been told that confessing would result in leniency, while continuing to deny involvement would guarantee the electric chair. And shortly before 2 o'clock in the morning on November 17th, Chester Weger broke down and gave Deputy Dummett what the authorities had been seeking for 8 months, a confession. The confession Chester Weger provided in the early morning hours of November 17, 1960, contained details that investigators found compelling. According to the statement he signed, Chester had finished his morning duties at Starved Rock Lodge on March 14th at approximately 11 o'clock. He wrote a letter to a friend, ate lunch around 11:30, and then returned to help with the washing of luncheon dishes and pots. He finished shortly before 3 in the afternoon and left the lodge, walking down the trail toward St. Louis Canyon. According to the confession, Chester encountered the three women near a bridge at the entrance to the canyon approximately 25 minutes after leaving the lodge. What happened next, as described in the confession, began as an attempted robbery that spiraled into murder. Chester claimed he grabbed at what he thought was a purse hanging over one woman's shoulder, but which turned out to be a pair of binoculars. He began to run past the women back out of the canyon, but one of them, later identified as Frances Murphy, started hitting him with a camera or pair of binoculars. The confession described how Chester then attacked the women with frozen tree branches he picked up from the ground. He struck Lillian Oetting over the head until she fell unconscious. He used the same brutal method on Frances Murphy and Mildred Lindquist. According to the statement, after the women were unconscious or dead, Chester bound their hands with twine, removed some of their clothing, and dragged their bodies to a shallow cave at the base of the canyon wall. He claimed that while moving the bodies, he saw a red and white airplane flying overhead and became concerned that it might be a state police aircraft that could spot him from above, which prompted him to hide the bodies more carefully under the rocky overhang. Certain details in the confession seemed to corroborate Chester's account. Investigators were able to locate the pilot of a red and white airplane, who confirmed that he had indeed been flying over Starved Rock State Park on the afternoon of March 14th. The fact that Chester mentioned this specific detail, something that would have been difficult for him to know unless he had been present at the scene, struck investigators as significant evidence of the confession's authenticity. The next day, November 17th, Chester participated in a filmed reenactment of the crimes at the murder scene. Footage and photographs from this reenactment would become iconic images associated with the case. Dressed in a white jacket and surrounded by law enforcement officials, Chester demonstrated how he claimed to have tied the victims' hands, how he had struck them with the tree branches, and how he had dragged their bodies into the cave. The reenactment was designed to show the public and potential jurors that Chester knew details about the crime that only the killer could know. But just days after providing this detailed confession and participating in the reenactment, Chester Weger was appointed a public defender, and everything changed. As soon as he had legal representation and advice from someone whose sole obligation was to protect Chester's interests rather than secure a conviction, Chester recanted his confession. He claimed that the confession had been obtained through duress, that he had been subjected to physical abuse and relentless psychological pressure, and that he had been threatened repeatedly with the electric chair. Chester's attorney, John A. McNamara of Marseilles, Illinois, would argue vigorously that the confession should be thrown out as unreliable and the product of coercion. McNamara contended that investigators had employed tactics that were designed specifically to break down Chester's will and compel him to confess regardless of whether he was actually guilty. The marathon interrogation sessions, the sleep deprivation, the constant surveillance, the threats of execution, all of these elements combined to create conditions under which an innocent person might confess simply to make the pressure stop. Despite Chester's recantation and McNamara's arguments, a LaSalle County grand jury returned indictments against Chester Weger for all three murders, as well as for the rape and robbery at Matheson State Park. The state's attorney made a strategic decision not to prosecute all of the charges simultaneously. Instead, they elected to try Chester only for the murder of Lillian Oetting. This legal tactic was common at the time. By securing a conviction on one murder charge first, prosecutors preserved their ability to try Chester for the other murders later if the first conviction was overturned on appeal. It also simplified the trial by focusing the jury's attention on a single victim rather than requiring them to consider three separate murders simultaneously. The trial was scheduled to begin on February 13, 1961, less than a year after the murders had occurred. But finding an impartial jury in a case that had received such extensive publicity proved extraordinarily difficult. The court ended up calling over 350 potential jurors before finally seating a panel of 12 who could credibly claim they had not already formed strong opinions about Chester Weger's guilt or innocence. The publicity surrounding the case had been so intense and widespread that finding anyone in Illinois who hadn't heard about the Starved Rock murders and formed some opinion about them was nearly impossible. When the trial finally began, the prosecution built its case primarily on Chester's confession and the reenactment. They called numerous witnesses who testified about the scratches on Chester's face in the days after the murders. They presented the twine that had been used to bind the victims, arguing that it matched twine found in the kitchen at Starved Rock Lodge, where Chester worked. They called a wood expert who testified that a piece of wood found embedded in Lillian Oetting's skull came from the blood-stained club found near the murder scene, which matched the description Chester had given in his confession of the murder weapon he used. They also presented Chester's leather jacket, which had been examined by FBI analysts who found bloodstains on it. While the testing available in 1961 was not sophisticated enough to definitively determine whether the blood was human or animal in origin, the presence of bloodstains on Chester's jacket, combined with all the other evidence, created a compelling circumstantial case for his guilt. The defense, led by John McNamara, focused heavily on attacking the confession's reliability. McNamara called witnesses who corroborated Chester's claim that he had been at a barbershop getting a haircut during the time when the murders likely occurred. He emphasized that Chester had passed 6 polygraph tests before failing the one administered by John Reed. He highlighted the coercive tactics investigators had employed, including the marathon interrogation sessions and the explicit threats of execution. McNamara also pointed out significant problems with the physical evidence. Hair samples collected from the crime scene included both blonde and dark hairs that clearly did not all belong to the victims. If Chester, who did not have black hair, was the sole perpetrator, where did those black hairs come from? No fingerprints were found at the crime scene that matched Chester's. The alleged murder weapons, the tree branches, bore no fingerprints at all. Perhaps most troubling was what the defense characterized as a fundamental mismatch between the physical evidence and Chester's confession. Chester stood 5 feet 8 inches tall and weighed approximately 150 pounds. The 3 victims were all mature women of average to above average size. The idea that this relatively small young man could have overpowered and killed 3 adult women in broad daylight in a public park where other hikers might have heard screams or witnessed the attack strained credulity. Yet the confession required the jury to believe exactly that scenario. McNamara also raised questions about the timeline. Chester's confession placed him at the murder scene around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but several witnesses testified that they had seen the 3 women alive and walking near the lodge at approximately 3:30 or even 4 o'clock. If those witnesses were correct, Chester could not have killed the women at 3 o'clock as his confession claimed. The state attempted to impeach these witnesses, suggesting their memories were unreliable or that they had confused the date, but the defense insisted this represented reasonable doubt about the confession's accuracy. The trial lasted weeks, with both sides presenting extensive testimony and evidence. When closing arguments concluded and the judge provided jury instructions, 12 citizens of LaSalle County retired to deliberate on whether Chester Otto Weger was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of murdering Lillian Oetting. The burden of proof rested entirely with the prosecution. The jury could not convict unless they were convinced to a moral certainty that Chester had committed the crime. After deliberating for hours, the jury returned to the courtroom and announced their verdict. Guilty. They had found Chester Weger guilty of murdering Lillian Oetting. When the judge asked if there was any reason why sentence should not be pronounced, Chester stood and maintained his innocence, stating that he had never killed anyone and that his confession had been coerced. But his protestations made no difference. The judge sentenced Chester Otto Weger to life imprisonment in the Illinois Department of Corrections. Chester Weger was 22 years old when he entered prison. He left behind a wife and 2 young children, including his daughter Becky, who would grow up visiting her father behind bars, never knowing him as a free man during her formative years. Chester maintained from the moment he recanted his confession that he was innocent, that he had been railroaded by a system more interested in closing a high-profile case than in ensuring justice was actually served. But the wheels of the legal system ground forward, and Chester's appeals were denied at every level. As Chester moved through his 30s, 40s, and into middle age, the world outside prison walls changed dramatically. The cultural upheavals of the 1960s gave way to the economic transformations of the 70s and 80s. Technology advanced at an accelerating pace. DNA analysis, which didn't exist at the time of Chester's trial, became the gold standard for forensic evidence in criminal cases. The interrogation techniques that had been used to extract Chester's confession came under increasing scrutiny and criticism from psychologists and legal scholars who documented how such methods could produce false confessions from innocent people. The landscape of wrongful conviction advocacy also changed significantly. Organizations like the Innocence Project, founded in 1992, began using DNA testing to systematically exonerate individuals who had been wrongfully convicted. As these exonerations accumulated, reaching first into the dozens, then the hundreds, public awareness grew that the criminal justice system was far more fallible than many had previously believed. False confessions, which skeptics had long dismissed as implausible, were documented in case after case. Innocent people, it turned out, did confess to crimes they didn't commit when subjected to certain interrogation techniques. Chester followed these developments as best he could from within prison, reading about exonerations, learning about advances in DNA technology, and hoping that eventually someone would take a serious interest in his case and subject it to modern scrutiny. But for years, that interest never materialized. His case was old, the physical evidence was scattered or degraded, and he had no powerful advocates on the outside pushing for a reinvestigation. Meanwhile, Chester's parole hearings continued on a regular cycle. Every few years, he would appear before the parole board, answer their questions, and await their decision. And every time, the decision was the same: denied. The board would cite his continued insistence on innocence, the brutal nature of the crime, opposition from the victims' families or law enforcement, or simply a determination that he had not yet served sufficient time. Chester would return to his cell and begin counting down the years until his next hearing. By the time Chester reached his 70s, he had become one of the longest-serving inmates in the Illinois prison system. The young dishwasher who entered prison in 1961 had become an elderly man, his health declining, his hair gray, his body showing the effects of decades of incarceration. Yet his mind remained sharp, and his insistence on his innocence never wavered. To anyone who asked, Chester maintained the same story he had told for decades. He was innocent. His confession had been coerced. The real killers had never been caught. It would have been easy to dismiss Chester as simply another inmate who couldn't accept responsibility for his crimes. Prisons are full of people who claim they didn't do it, who insist they were framed or railroaded, who blame everyone but themselves for their incarceration. But a few people who examined Chester's case began to see elements that troubled them, details that didn't quite add up, questions that had never been adequately answered. One of those people was attorney Andy Hale, who would eventually become the driving force behind the effort to exonerate Chester Weger. Hale's involvement would mark the beginning of a new chapter in a case that many had considered closed for decades. The fight for Chester's freedom, which had seemed hopeless for so long, was about to gain new life. In the decades since Chester Weger's conviction, forensic DNA analysis had advanced from a nascent technology to an incredibly sophisticated science, capable of extracting genetic information from the most degraded and challenging samples. One of the most significant advances came in the form of genealogical DNA analysis, the same technology that had allowed millions of people to trace their ancestry through services like 23andMe and Ancestry.com. This technology could also be applied to forensic samples to identify unknown individuals by finding their relatives in genealogical databases. Andy Hale recognized that these advances in DNA technology offered a potential breakthrough in Chester's case. In 2021, Hale filed a motion with the court seeking permission to conduct new DNA testing using the latest methods on evidence from the Starved Rock murders. This time, the request was not simply to determine whether Chester's DNA was present on the evidence, but to identify whose DNA was actually there and potentially determine the identity of the real perpetrators. After more legal wrangling, in March of 2022, a judge granted permission for this new round of DNA testing. The testing would focus particularly on items of evidence that had yielded inconclusive or partial results in earlier testing, but which might now provide definitive identifications using the latest technology. The evidence was sent to a specialized forensic laboratory equipped to handle such complex analysis. Months passed as the laboratory worked to extract, amplify, and sequence whatever DNA could be recovered from the decades-old evidence. Hair samples, clothing fibers, the twine used to bind the victims, all of it underwent intensive analysis. In November of 2022, the results came back, and they were stunning. The DNA testing had successfully identified DNA from multiple individuals on various pieces of evidence from the crime scene. Critically, none of the identifiable DNA matched Chester Weger. The twine that had been used to bind the victim's hands, a central piece of evidence in the prosecution's case, contained DNA from at least one unknown male individual who was definitely not Chester. Hair samples that had been collected from the victim's clothing and from the crime scene also contained DNA from unknown individuals. Most significantly, the genealogical analysis pointed towards specific individuals who might be linked to the crime. The DNA profile from the twine showed characteristics suggesting a familial relationship to two brothers named William and Raymond Bray. These two men, who lived in the area at the time of the murders, had never been seriously investigated as suspects in the original investigation. Neither man was alive in 2022 to answer questions about their potential involvement, but the DNA evidence suggested they might have had some connection to the crime. Further research into the Bray brothers revealed intriguing possibilities. William Bray had died in 1961, just months after Chester's conviction. Raymond Bray lived until 2003. Neither brother had ever been publicly connected to the Starved Rock murders during their lifetimes, but family members and acquaintances now came forward with disturbing information suggesting that at least one of the brothers may have been involved in the killings. According to these accounts, which would need to be evaluated carefully for reliability, William Bray had allegedly made statements suggesting he had knowledge of or involvement in the murders. Some family members claimed he had exhibited violent tendencies and had a history of volatile behavior. Whether these statements and recollections represented genuine evidence of guilt or were simply the product of selective memory and hindsight, bias would be matters for the court to determine. The DNA results created a dilemma for prosecutors and law enforcement. On one hand, the evidence clearly showed that DNA from unknown individuals was present on critical pieces of evidence from the crime scene. On the other hand, the prosecution could argue that this didn't definitively prove Chester wasn't involved, only that he might not have acted alone or that some of the evidence had been contaminated over the decades of storage. Andy Hale viewed the DNA results as vindication. Here was scientific proof that Chester had been telling the truth for more than 60 years. The twine used to bind the victims contained DNA from someone other than Chester. Hair evidence contained DNA from unknown individuals. None of the identifiable DNA matched Chester. In Hale's view, this was powerful exculpatory evidence that should result in Chester's conviction being vacated and his name being cleared. Hale filed motions with the court arguing that the DNA evidence, combined with the problems with Chester's confession and the other weaknesses in the original case, warranted a hearing to consider whether Chester's conviction should be overturned. The court agreed to hold what's known as a mini-trial, an evidentiary hearing where both sides could present arguments and evidence related to Chester's claims of actual innocence. The stakes were enormous. Chester was now 83 years old, in declining health, and facing the very real possibility that he might die before the legal system could formally acknowledge his innocence. For the victims' families, the hearing represented another painful reopening of wounds that had never fully healed. For law enforcement and prosecutors, it represented a challenge to a conviction they still believed was righteous and justified. But before the mini-trial could be completed, the case would take another dramatic turn as more information emerged about alternative suspects and theories about who might have actually killed Francis Murphy, Mildred Lindquist, and Lillian Oetting on that March afternoon in 1960. As Chester Weger's legal team worked to build the case for his exoneration, they began investigating alternative theories about who might have committed the Starved Rock murders. One line of inquiry led them into the shadowy world of organized crime and the Chicago Outfit, the powerful mafia organization that controlled much illegal activity in Illinois and beyond during the 1950s and 60s. The theory that the Starved Rock murders might have been connected to the mob, rather than being a random robbery-turned-murder, rested on several pieces of circumstantial evidence and witness testimony that had largely been ignored or dismissed during the original investigation. At the time the three women were killed, the Chicago Outfit was at the height of its power, involved in everything from illegal gambling and loan sharking to labor racketeering and political corruption. One of the most intriguing pieces of evidence supporting the mob theory came in the form of deathbed confessions and statements made by individuals allegedly connected to organized crime. In 2005, a man named Clyde Norton, who had been questioned as a suspect in the original investigation but never charged, allegedly told a relative on his deathbed that he knew who had killed the three women at Starved Rock. Norton claimed that the murders had been committed by four men who were connected to the mob, and that the killing had not been random, but had instead been related to some kind of organized crime activity. Norton's deathbed statement was not the only such claim. Other individuals with alleged mob connections also reportedly made statements over the years, suggesting they had knowledge of who really committed the murders. The problem with deathbed confessions and second-hand accounts of statements made by deceased individuals is that they are inherently difficult to verify. The people making the alleged statements are no longer alive to be questioned, cross-examined, or held accountable for the accuracy of their claims. Nevertheless, investigators working on Chester's behalf began to piece together a theory about how the mob might have been involved. According to this theory, the three women may have stumbled upon some kind of illegal activity occurring in the park, perhaps a meeting or transaction related to organized crime operations. Their unexpected presence created a problem that required elimination. This would explain the extreme brutality of the murders, the fact that three women were killed rather than simply being robbed and allowed to leave, and certain other aspects of the crime that had never made complete sense under the prosecution's theory. The severed fingertip from Francis Murphy's hand took on new significance in light of the mob theory. While the prosecution had never adequately explained this detail, some mob watchers noted that cutting off a fingertip was sometimes used as a signature or message in organized crime killings. Whether this represented genuine evidence of mob involvement or simply another example of pattern seeking in ambiguous evidence remained a matter of debate. Investigators also discovered that several men with mob connections had been in the Starved Rock area around the time of the murders. Some of these individuals had criminal records that included violence. Some had allegedly bragged to friends or associates about having been involved in the killings. But as with the deathbed confessions, much of this evidence was fragmentary, secondhand, and difficult or impossible to corroborate given the passage of time and the deaths of many key witnesses. The Bray brothers, whose DNA had been linked to evidence from the crime scene through the genealogical analysis, also became subjects of intense scrutiny. Investigators discovered that the brothers had some connections, however tenuous, to individuals involved in gambling and other activities that might have brought them into contact with mob associates. Whether these connections were significant or simply the kind of tangential associations that would be present for many people living in Illinois in 1960 was unclear. What became increasingly clear as this alternative investigation proceeded was that the original Illinois State Police investigation in 1960 had been remarkably narrow in its focus. Once investigators zeroed in on Chester Weger as their prime suspect, they appear to have largely stopped seriously investigating other possibilities. Tips and leads that pointed toward alternative suspects were not pursued with the same vigor that was applied to building the case against Chester. This is a common problem in criminal investigations. Once law enforcement becomes convinced they have identified the perpetrator, confirmation bias can lead them to overlook or dismiss evidence that points in other directions. Several witnesses who had been at Starved Rock State Park on the day of the murders had reported seeing suspicious individuals or activities. Some had seen men who didn't appear to be typical park visitors, who seemed out of place, or who were acting strangely. But because these sightings didn't directly implicate Chester Weger, they received minimal follow-up investigation. Decades later, with those witnesses now deceased or their memories dimmed by time, it was impossible to know whether any of these sightings might have been significant. The challenge with alternative suspect theories in old cases is that they often remain just that: theories. Unless there is hard evidence definitively connecting an alternative suspect to the crime, prosecutors can always argue that these theories are merely speculation, that they don't prove the convicted individual is innocent, only that someone else might also have been involved. In Chester's case, the DNA evidence connecting the Bray brothers to crime scene evidence was suggestive, but not conclusive. It showed that their DNA was present on some of the evidence, but it couldn't definitively prove they had committed the murders. Still, the accumulation of evidence pointing away from Chester and toward alternative suspects had grown substantial. The DNA evidence that didn't match Chester, the deathbed confessions and statements implicating others, the unexplained details of the crime that fit better with the mob theory than with the prosecution's theory of a lone dishwasher committing an opportunistic robbery, the problems with Chester's confession, including timeline issues and the coercive interrogation techniques that had been used to obtain it. All of this created, at minimum, serious questions about whether Chester Weger had received a fair trial and whether his conviction could withstand scrutiny under modern standards. As the date approached for the evidentiary hearing that would determine whether Chester's conviction should be overturned, both sides prepared to present their strongest arguments. For Chester's legal team, the goal was to demonstrate that the combination of the faulty confession, the DNA evidence pointing to alternative suspects, and the other weaknesses in the original case added up to proof of actual innocence. For the prosecution, the goal was to show that despite the passage of more than 6 decades, the conviction remained sound, that Chester's confession had been voluntary, and that the DNA evidence didn't actually prove he wasn't involved in the murders. The evidentiary hearing to determine whether Chester Weger's conviction should be vacated was scheduled to begin in May of 2025. It would be conducted before LaSalle County Circuit Judge Michael Jantz, who would hear testimony and arguments from both sides and then issue a ruling on whether Chester had presented sufficient evidence to warrant overturning his 1961 conviction for murdering Lillian Oetting. The hearing represented Chester's best and possibly last chance at full exoneration. At 85 years old, his health was failing. He had survived prison for nearly 6 decades, had endured the humiliation and hardship of life as a convicted murderer, and had steadfastly maintained his innocence through it all. Now, as his life entered its final chapter, the legal system would finally reconsider whether justice had been served in his case. Andy Hale and the rest of Chester's legal team prepared exhaustively for the hearing. They assembled an array of expert witnesses who would testify about various aspects of the case. Forensic experts would explain the DNA evidence and what it showed about the presence of unknown individuals at the crime scene. Psychologists and interrogation experts would testify about false confessions, explaining how the techniques used to extract Chester's confession were known to produce unreliable statements even from innocent people. Legal scholars would address the constitutional issues raised by Chester's treatment during the investigation. The hearing would also provide an opportunity to present the testimony about alternative suspects, including the information about the Bray brothers and the various statements and deathbed confessions that had emerged over the years pointing toward mob involvement. While much of this evidence was circumstantial and fragmentary, its cumulative weight might be sufficient to establish reasonable doubt about Chester's guilt. The prosecution, meanwhile, prepared to defend the original conviction. They would argue that despite the DNA evidence and other new information, the fundamental facts of the case remained unchanged. Chester had confessed to the murders in detail. He had participated in a reenactment showing his knowledge of details that only the killer would know. The physical evidence, including the twine and the blood on his jacket, was consistent with his involvement. The scratches on his face in the days after the murders suggested he had been in a violent altercation. All of this, the prosecutors would contend, still pointed toward Chester's guilt. The hearing began with opening statements from both sides laying out their respective positions. Hale began by painting a picture of a young man who had been ground down by relentless interrogation and coercive tactics until he confessed to crimes he didn't commit. He described the marathon interrogation sessions, the sleep deprivation, the explicit threats of execution, and the promise of leniency if Chester would just admit to the crimes. He explained how psychological research had demonstrated that these tactics could produce false confessions even from people who were completely innocent. The prosecution countered by emphasizing the specific details in Chester's confession that matched the crime scene and the circumstances of the murders. They argued that an innocent person couldn't have provided such detailed and accurate information unless they had actually committed the crimes. They acknowledged that some interrogation techniques in the 1960s would not be considered acceptable by modern standards, but they maintained that Chester's confession had been voluntary and reliable. Over several days, the hearing proceeded through testimony from various witnesses. DNA experts explained in technical detail what the genetic testing had revealed. One expert testified that the DNA found on the twine used to bind the victims was definitely not Chester's and appeared to match genetic markers associated with the Bray family line. This expert explained that while the DNA evidence couldn't definitively identify a specific individual due to the degraded nature of the samples, it could exclude Chester and point toward a different family entirely. Cross-examination of the DNA expert by the prosecution focused on the limitations of the testing and the possibility of contamination. Had the evidence been properly stored over 6 decades? Could DNA have been deposited on the evidence through secondary transfer? Was it possible that Chester's DNA was simply no longer detectable on the evidence due to degradation, while other DNA had been better preserved? The expert acknowledged these were theoretical possibilities, but maintained that the most straightforward interpretation of the evidence was that someone other than Chester had handled the twine. The testimony of Dr. Richard Leo, a leading expert on false confessions and coercive interrogations, proved particularly compelling. Dr. Leo had studied hundreds of cases involving confessions, both true and false, and had identified specific interrogation tactics that were most likely to produce unreliable statements. He testified that virtually every one of these high-risk tactics had been employed in Chester's case. Marathon interrogation sessions lasting many hours, isolation from legal counsel, minimization of the moral seriousness of the crime, combined with maximization of the consequences of continued denial, explicit threats of harsh punishment, promises of leniency in exchange for confession, and pressure applied while the subject was exhausted and psychologically vulnerable. Dr. Leo explained that while most people assume innocent individuals would never confess to serious crimes they didn't commit, research had documented hundreds of proven false confessions. Young people, those with lower intellectual capacity, and those subjected to extended high-pressure interrogations were particularly vulnerable to making false confessions. Chester, at 21 years old, with limited education, subjected to interrogation techniques specifically designed to break down his resistance, fit the profile of someone at high risk for false confession. The prosecution's cross-examination of Dr. Leo focused on whether he could definitively say that Chester's confession was false. Dr. Leo acknowledged that he could not make that determination with absolute certainty based solely on reviewing documents and transcripts decades after the fact. But he maintained that the interrogation methods used in Chester's case were highly coercive and that his confession bore several hallmarks of false confessions, including the recantation almost immediately after he secured legal representation and certain inconsistencies between his confession and the physical evidence. Testimony also addressed the timeline discrepancies that had troubled some observers from the very beginning. Several witnesses had reported seeing the three women alive and well at approximately 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon on the day of the murders. Chester's confession placed the killings at around 3 o'clock. If the witnesses were correct about the timing of their sightings, Chester could not have killed the women when his confession claimed he did. The prosecution had argued at the original trial that these witnesses were mistaken about the date or time, but the defense contended that this represented yet another indicator that the confession was unreliable. The hearing also included emotional testimony from members of the victims' families, some of whom remained convinced of Chester's guilt, and others who had come to believe that the wrong person had been convicted. This split within the families themselves illustrated how complex and painful this case remained, even after more than 6 decades. For some family members, accepting that Chester might be innocent meant accepting that the real killers had never been caught, that justice had not been served for their murdered loved ones, that the closure they thought they had achieved in 1961 had been illusory. After several days of testimony and arguments, both sides rested their cases. Judge Jans took the matter under advisement, stating that he would review all the evidence and testimony carefully before issuing a ruling. Legal observers predicted that a decision might not come for several months, as the judge would need to thoroughly analyze the complex scientific evidence, the legal precedents governing post-conviction relief, and the substantial record that had been developed over the course of the hearing. But time was running out for Chester Weger in ways that transcended the legal calendar. His health had been deteriorating steadily, and the stress of the hearing and the ongoing legal battle had taken its toll. Throughout his 80s, Chester had managed to maintain a relatively good quality of life despite his advanced age. But by the time the May 2025 hearing concluded, those close to him could see that he was failing. On June 7, 2025, less than a month after the conclusion of the evidentiary hearing and before Judge Jans could issue his ruling, Chester Otto Weger died. He was 86 years old. He died having spent 64 years, from age 21 to 85, either incarcerated or on parole for a crime he maintained to his last breath he did not commit. He died without receiving the formal exoneration he had sought for so long. The news of Chester's death sent ripples through the community of people who had been following his case. His daughter Becky, who had spent her entire life fighting for her father's vindication, was devastated not just by the loss of her father, but by the cruel timing that had robbed him of the possibility of seeing his name cleared before he died. Andy Hale, who had devoted years to Chester's case, vowed to continue fighting for exoneration even after his client's death, arguing that Chester's memory and reputation deserved to be restored. The legal question of what happens to a post-conviction petition after the petitioner dies is complex and varies by jurisdiction. In some cases, such proceedings are considered moot once the convicted individual passes away, since there is no longer anyone who can benefit from the relief sought. In other cases, courts have allowed family members to continue pursuing exoneration on behalf of deceased relatives, recognizing the importance of clearing the names of those who were wrongfully convicted. In Chester's case, his legal team filed motions asking Judge Jantz to proceed with issuing a ruling despite Chester's death, arguing that the interests of justice and the need to establish the truth about what happened at Starved Rock in 1960 warranted a decision on the merits of the case. As of the time this story is being told, that decision remains pending. Whether Judge Jantz will rule on Chester's claims or will instead declare the matter moot due to Chester's death is unknown. What is known is that Chester Otto Weger spent virtually his entire adult life either behind bars or branded as a triple murderer. He watched his children grow up from behind prison glass. He missed his daughter's wedding, the births of his grandchildren, and countless other milestones of normal family life. He grew old in confinement, maintaining his innocence through decades when it would have been easier to simply admit guilt, express remorse, and hope for parole. He endured the contempt and hatred of those who believed him to be a brutal killer. And he died before the legal system could formally acknowledge what he and his supporters believed to be the truth, that he was innocent. If you found this deep dive into one of America's most enduring criminal mysteries compelling, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel.